Hello, my name is Tolg and I exist, therefore I think too much. I'm gonna start reading Mirror of Simple Souls by Marguerite Porete, the introduction, part 8 of the introduction, written by Ellen Babinski, and her interpretation of what the Mirror of Simple Souls means. Maybe. 30 chapters into the Mirror of Simple Souls, there were questions. I had questions. I, at one point, mixed up 1300, the year she was participating in, with 1100. So started rereading the introduction, which I did not start with, and I am at a point where I regret having read it, and now I feel like I need to get through it, and it's longer than I had thought it was, so there's the reasoning for everything. It'd be really weird if you decided to tune in here instead of watching any of the others, but c'est la vie, it's your life to live. I rant while reading, and in ranting and generally talking, I cuss, and if you don't like cussing, you don't have to watch these. No one's holding you hostage. And if they are, what a mean thing to hold you hostage to. They could have chosen any medium, and instead they chose me. Wow. Alright, so it's been a minute, and I don't remember where I left off. I marked it down. I just don't really remember what the fuck it was about. Oh, right. Man is more powerful than God because man can steal the will from God. That is how Babinski understands Porete. Alright, so this, what is it called? Paragraph starts off bizarrely. And this is your warning. Sin, then, is the freely chosen removal of the will from divine being. No, it isn't. If the argument has been, which, this book has pretty much lined up with flesh is sin, which is a very Christian argument. When you're born into sin. Then it is not free will by which you sin. And it cannot therein be freely chosen. You're just damned to sin. And so the removal from divine being would insinuate that the creation of the divine being is the removal from the divine being, so the action of that which is divine is removed from that which is divine. Are they even acting on anything anymore? Is your God truly your God if your God cannot act of their own accord? Okay. And therefore virtue is the freely chosen returning of the will to God. For God has, you can be virtuous and non-religious. Okie dokie. For God has freely given the gift of free will to the soul, implying that there is a means by which God cannot freely give, but be forced to give? Without a why. Whoa, what? Okay, for God has freely given the gift of free will to the soul without a why is in quotation marks. So, without question? Simply out of the fullness of God's goodness. There can be a halfness of God's goodness, a quarter of God's goodness. Precisely because of the nature of the gift, the will cannot be taken away without the soul's willing of it. When was the gift given? Debatable as to where one inherits sin. For to take the will from the soul would contradict the goodness of God in giving free will in the first place. Yes. But would not dying to yourself contradict God's will of having created you, and thus the perfect soul dying to itself to have God live through it is also sinful? The will then can only be placed where it belongs by the will itself. So the will is now acting outside of God's will because the will is acting of its own accord? Too many questions, way too many questions. The will must be rendered back to God. How can the will get away from God? Why does the will have its own will? In the same way and as freely as it was first given, thus elevating the individual who has the will to the level of God, or elevating the will itself, being able to act upon itself to the capacity of what God can do. Whoop. Not sure who has the ego in this situation, but there is ego here, in the room with us. The free rendering of the will back to God, where it belongs, is the goal of the spiritual path. Oh, that's a very simple path. And is the particular task of the fifth stage. The soul who has rendered her will freely to God is the annihilated perfect soul. This would insinuate that annihilation is rendering free will back to God, but annihilation of the soul does not necessarily imply the same thing as giving over free will. If you were to simplify it, upsettingly so, killing yourself is not the same as denying yourself the capacity to act of your own accord. In this state of annihilation, the soul finds her perfection. Okay, that's just an elongated version of saying annihilated perfect soul. You have explained nothing. She no longer has a will with which to will or desire, but rather God's will alone wills in her. What do they call that? Stockholm Syndrome. The captor knows best. I lost my place. If the soul freely wills anything independently of God, why exist? She separates herself from the divine will. Thus the will, for Marguerite, is the locus. Ooh, I did look that up last time, and I think it had something to do with just general knowledge. Whoops. Either of separation from God or of spiritual perfection. If perfection is attained, then the soul wills not her own will, but only the will of God's wills in her. Oh. We have all lost understanding of where the S goes. The will of God wills in her. Yep, the S does not go there. That's the danger of repeating one word too many times in one sentence. Okay, so this entire paragraph is repeating in a rather confusing manner the prior paragraph. And I have said this to others. Repetition, reformatting what it is you say, is not explaining what it is you say. It's like when you define a word, you can't use that same word in the definition of itself. Okie dokie, moving on. The Trinitarian character of the soul. Why does the soul have three parts? That wasn't explained, that was just introduced. Other than to say that prior paragraphs explained that the movement of acting through different stages mirrored the Trinity of God. But it did not. It was just the progression of either that mirrored the fact that anything progressed. But the actions did not mirror each other. It was simply the fact that anything progressed at all. So that is actually why the book is named The Mirror of Simple Souls, is the progression of the soul through different acts of being. And therein is why this starts off the Trinitarian character of the soul. It didn't explain itself. It was just a means to tie itself closer to the Trinity of the Godhead by utilizing the same formatting of words, where it, thought out, it doesn't make a lick of fucking sense. Ability, intellect, understanding is the created nature of the sad soul alone, which is not as good as the lost soul. Or wait, one or the other. I don't know. Lost soul, sad soul, can't remember which one's better, but one of them is better than the other one. The free will of the soul, freely given by divine gift, can turn itself toward created things or toward divine things. Okie dokie. If the soul remains in her own will, she is turned toward created things, and ability is limited insofar as it is impeded from carrying out its enterprise, which is the will of God. Wow, humanity is powerful in that it can impede the will of God. Fuck. Also, I have always hated this when I was understood to be Christian, and at any point. If God is all good, then what right does humanity have to sneer at anything God creates? Why is what God creates less than? Shouldn't what God creates be good too? If God is only good. The intellect is limited, I'll say. The intellect is limited thereby also, since intellect comes from ability, Jesus Christ. And therefore it will be limited in its knowledge. Jesus Christ. The knowledge is limited in its knowledge. By its knowledge. As long as the will wills something other than the will of God, it remains in an existence independent of God. Holy hell, that's powerful. Intellect, generated by ability and controlled by the will, gives only as much knowledge as the will allows. I would assume then it would be that if you open yourself up, there's more knowledge to be had through God rather than through the limited understanding of an individual. And that's why certain people do drugs. They believe they're mainstreaming God's truth. You know what's a series people should watch? And is based on a true story? At least one of them is. True Detective. First 2 seasons. 3rd season, I think, was a means of editing out anything that someone had created of their own accord. Not that it's a bad season, just, it doesn't follow the intention of the first 2 seasons. Therefore, the lost soul does not possess understanding, which is related to divine things, because the will of the lost soul is oriented toward created things. That's a repetition rather than an explanation, thereby impeding ability and limiting intellect. Well, is the intellect limited by intellect, or is the lost soul limiting its own intellect? Only the sad soul. Okay, so the sad soul is better than the lost soul. 1 vote for depression. Only the sad soul has the capacity for understanding, because the will of this soul is oriented toward divine things, repetition rather than explanation. Thus, the object of the will sets the limits for the enterprise of ability and the function of the intellect, and therefore also the kind or level of knowledge. type would have been a better word there. Not that it really insinuates anything else, just... For Marguerite, reason and love are personified acts, okay, and each has an intellect appropriate to its function, which allows to each its own kind of knowledge. Certainly each subject in life has something different to learn about it. Is that what it means? I don't think so. Reason has a specific and positive role in the quest for spiritual perfection, namely that reasoning activity guides the will with a particular kind of perspectiveness. That cannot be a word. Because I did not say it right. Perceptiveness. Perception would have been good. A particular way of grasping what is before the mind. Okie dokie. A particular way of grasping what is before the mind. What is it? It's the thing I struggle with, obviously. Particular way of grasping conception, the ability to conceive of something. Reason, through the virtues, teaches the will the important preliminary steps of evangelical perfection in the first 4 stages. Okay, the reason I paused so dramatically on the word evangelical is, ew. Okay, how do I put that into words? I have it in thought. I don't know that I have it in words. You label so many things, the understanding of it is lost in just labeling it. To evangelize. The reason it's a practice separate from simply practicing Christianity is the thought that, well, personally, I understand it, that quantity matters more than quality. Being an evangelical Christian is the understanding that you need to perform works in order to garner an army for Christianity. You need to convince others that their way is wrong and it needs to be God's way, quote unquote, your way, in order for it to be right. However, evangelical Christianity, like all Christianity, teaches that you ought to follow God, but in evangelizing, a lot of people have a tendency to construe God in the most convenient way for themselves. And it has taken a weird route, where, support me, because our whole goal is to get more people believing in God, and only in hopes of doing that, I am a tool for God, and in being a tool for God, I need to be supported by your efforts monetarily to be able to get more people towards God, which then became a whole game of accumulating money. And the person with the most money is the best tool. And, sight of who is actually paying attention to what Jesus said, be like God, do not be like me, I am man, is lost. And then the other thing, it's a quote from the Bible, you go find it, I don't know where it is. Many will come to me saying they know me, and I will look at them and say I know them not. That is, I think, a quote from God. And then, another one, the road to heaven is narrow and few will find it, and the road to where the path to hell is paved is wide and paved with good intentions. And therein I do not like evangelical Christianity. The soul would make no progress toward perfection without this guidance. Blech. Reason and the virtues carefully teach a particular kind of knowledge to the soul, molding her ability and thus producing the sort of intellect that can allow the soul to make further progress. The will, in order to be what it ought to be, must first be guided by reason to learn its proper object, the will of God, so that ability may fulfill its enterprise and generate the intellect by which the soul may progress along the path toward perfection. The path to hell is wide and paved with good intentions. And what's the reason to be created to be perfect? Okay, bye. Drink well, eat well, sleep well. Do things as well as you can manage to do them. Bye.